And so now it's your turn. We have roughly 20 minutes to direct your questions. I'd ask you to approach a microphone and to state your name and affiliation and direct your question, or if you want to leave it open, we'll let the panel address the issue. All right, the gentleman that is first in line.
Hi, thanks. I'm Jamie Strawbridge from Inside U.S. Trade. I had a question for Dr. Lardy on engagement with China on economic issues. Just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit. I guess part of it's due to the campaign season, but there's been a lot of tough talk on China from both candidates. Also, the U.S. has brought a series of WTO cases against China this year, for instance, and we continue to push them on a range of economic issues that are priorities for us. With the new leadership coming in Beijing next week, what advice would you have for the second-term Obama administration? Is it wise, if we're trying to get them to do what we think is in their interest and ours, should we kind of now step back, take it easy on the WTO cases, let this leadership come in? Or what is the smartest way to approach this so that they have the space and willingness to undertake some of these economic reforms? Thank you.
An easy question.
Well, I'll begin by saying I think the Obama administration...
I think the Obama administration's approach to China was basically pretty good. I think, as most of you know, President Obama had more direct one-to-one meetings with President Hu Jintao in 4 years than President Bush had with his counterpart in 8 years. There's been a lot of face-to-face discussion at a strategic geopolitical level, and I certainly hope that will continue. But the other thing this administration has done is to bring a lot more cases, as you suggest, and they didn't all come in the last year. It's been building. And we have brought a lot more cases against China for what we think are areas where they're not living up to their obligations. I hope that will continue as well, because I think the good news that we can say after 10 years of China's membership in the WTO is they accept the legitimacy of the dispute settlement process. They understand now how it works. They bring a few cases when they think other countries aren't living up to their obligations. They are the subject themselves of quite a few cases. They don't lose all of them, but they lose more than half. I guess Carla probably knows the numbers down much more precisely. But the very good news is when China loses a case, it generally complies with the ruling of the dispute settlement panel, which is quite frankly better than you can say about the United States. So I think a lot of people think this combination of high-level strategic engagement and then down in the trenches on the trade is counterproductive. But I think the record of the last few years shows that it was started a bit by President Bush, but I think under Obama it accelerated. I think it is the best way to keep the engagement and try to enforce try to get China to live up the obligations that it made when it joined the WTO a decade or so ago.
And if you want China and others to do that, it'll be important for the United States to lead by example and to carry out the obligations it has under the WTO. Jessica, you had a question.
It's Jessica Einhorn, Peterson Board. I also wanted to ask Nick, so it's not a distribution here, but I've been looking for a while with your pointing out that what we need is the shift from investment to consumption. And the point, which certainly resonates in places like the United States and Europe, that would be greatly supported and even come about faster given momentum if there were safety nets. And today I found myself asking, I wonder whether the political culture of China is such that people would give up their personal savings on a bet that 20 or 30 years from now their government would be there to support them, or whether in fact it's not a straight line in terms of people moving from savings to consumption, even when a government steps forward and says, we'll be having this safety net for you.
Well, I very much agree with the thrust of your question. That is, people don't change their savings behavior based on promises that they're not sure will be fulfilled. But if you look closely at what's happened over the last 4 or 5 years, China's government has done a great deal they have rolled out a medical insurance scheme in the countryside that is voluntary. You don't have to belong, and if you want to participate, you pay a relatively small amount, like a couple dollars a year. And it's not gold-plated coverage, but the reimbursement rates are running at something like 50, 60, 70%. And as we saw this rolled out over the last few years, the rates of participation are like 95%. In other words, if you go county by county, because it's run at the county level, once the program is up and running, people see a neighbor that got some coverage, they sign up. As I say, the participation rate for that is over 90%. So at least in the health area. And China's never had any health insurance scheme in the countryside. And as I say, this is not a gold-plated system. It's nothing that we'd want to have as our insurance scheme. But if you've been in an environment where for centuries there's never been any health insurance in the countryside, it's a big step forward. So I'm still optimistic that there is some traction on building out the social safety net in terms of the impact on savings. Won't appear next quarter or the quarter after, but I think it's coming.
At the microphone.
Thank you. Dong Huiyu with China Review News Agency of Hong Kong. Yesterday, in the Party Congress report, President Hu Jintao proposed a 10-year perspective of doubling China's GDP and per capita by 2020. What impact do you think it will have on U.S.-China relations and global system? Thank you.
Well, I think, quite frankly, not very much, because China on these 5-year party meetings has frequently tossed out these numbers, like we're going to double GDP, and doubling by 2020 actually is not actually a very high rate of growth. It's below the average rate of growth of recent years. So I think this is a good slogan to give at the Party Congress, but operationally I'm not sure what significance it has. I think if China does the kinds of policy reforms that many people in China have been calling for, they will easily be able to meet that goal. It'll be a plus in terms of their relations with the United States, and I think with the rest of the world. We'll all be better off if China grows more rapidly rather than falling into a multi-year slump, which is, the bearish case.
Yes.
Antonio de Lecea, European Union delegation here to the U.S. You may expect that this question is addressed to Adam. And indeed, we agree on much, but we disagree on some as well. And particularly the titles of your presentation and the one of the European Commission forecast that you refer to are quite telling in this respect. You presented it as going nowhere. The title of the Commission forecast is Sailing Through Rough Waters. So we are sailing, we are going somewhere. And knowing yourself from the past, I think I may have misunderstood in the sense that I thought you said that the fact that there had been no tail risk, that there had been no breakup was not to be happy. I'm sure that's not what you meant. Okay. So now...
Sorry. Just to say, what I said was that should not be enough to make us happy.
Okay. Okay, thanks. So second point is yes, we are indeed in very troubled waters. The crisis was the consequence of at least 4 storms: the fiscal one, the competitiveness one, the financial, the banking one, and the institutional one. So the unfinished architecture. And we are working on all 4 fronts simultaneously, because we know that there are interactions amongst themselves, and therefore we cannot just provide for an optimal sequence. We must address all of them well ahead. So that makes things more difficult. We understand, and particularly the multipliers reflect all that, and the multipliers have been high, partly because of the confidence effect that has been based, that can be traced to the financial markets very, very largely, and to the decline in domestic demand. But what we're trying to do is to reverse all that negative multiplier and the vicious circle into a virtuous circle. So by addressing all that at the same time. And we are seeing that it's bearing fruit. So we see competitiveness that is increasing. We see exports in the distressed countries that is increasing. True, we need some more demand, and we are trying to give that through more investment from the EU budget and using better the EU transfers. So this is a way that we will be sailing. We will be sailing to a sustainable, certainly low growth in the short run, but much leaner economies and much sounder both growth and public finances. So yes. So the question now is, you said that we shouldn't do this. I mean, we shouldn't do all that at this pace. But frankly, with the constraints of the financial markets, which are not the same as those in the UK that you know well now, and those of the US, we are forced to do that quite quickly. So what is the alternative option? What the alternative path that you would propose?
Just quickly, Minister de la Sey and the delegation of the European Union here has long time been a friend of the Institute, and we hope the Institute has been and continues to be a friend of the European project. And so I'm glad you made sure that I was not misinterpreted. But friends have to be honest about the short term and what's going on. And so my forecast was not based on giving a handicap for difficulty. So if I was evaluating the contribution of various European policymakers, I would definitely say they are under a much bigger handicap than, say, some of our counterparts in this country, or some of my former counterparts in UK. But this meeting is not about that, even if I would say that the Commission is playing a much more constructive role than some other members of the Troika and players. That said, just to quickly come to a point, does one have space? Do you have fiscal room to do this more slowly and do this differently? I believe yes. So there were two charts that I didn't put up. One which shows that the feedback is from slow growth to budget deficits. So if you accept the idea that the markets are responding for the most part to the fiscal situation, which is not entirely obvious, but say that is true, it is a legitimate empirical question at what point you get diminishing returns, because by what you're doing to growth overwhelms what you're doing to increase revenues or decrease spending. And I would argue, this is in the spirit of what DeLong and Summers argued in their Brookings paper and what the IMF has started saying, and I was warning about this internally in Europe off the record the last few years, I would argue we're at that point. Now, the Commission has issued Box 1.5 in your autumn forecast, some discussion of this point, and I look forward to debating that in more detail. But to me, the evidence is quite clear that particularly you look at Spain, the feedback is from slow growth to eroding fiscal positions, not from eroding fiscal positions to slow growth. The second point is we shouldn't pretend that the markets are on a knife edge, leaving aside Greece. Greece is obviously a special case. We are not seeing capital flight in Europe. And the times I mentioned when some of us in the UK and elsewhere were quite terrified was when we started to see things that looked like capital jog out of Spain or Italy. And that was driven very much by banking system developments, not by economic macro developments. And so given the fact that the ECB has basically replaced the interbank market and there is no real evidence of capital departure from Italy and Spain, I think you can get away, frankly, with going more slowly, particularly if it's coordinated. So it's not about, oh, gee, look, France or Spain or Austria or whoever, pick your country, is not playing along. I think a coordinated pullback by the European member countries, the Euro area member countries, would be right.
At the microphone.
Thank you for doing this. Danny Xufengjiang with Xinhua News Agency from China. Two questions on the United States. Firstly, if Obamacare and the Dodd-Frank financial reform are two biggest legacy for Obama in his first administration, what might be his biggest legacy in the second term? Secondly, can Democratic and Republican lawmakers make good use of the fiscal cliff negotiation to push forward a big round of a grand bargain and a tax reform? Thank you.
So those were two questions, but actually I think they have the same answer, which is I think the biggest legacy that President Obama could look for in his second term, obviously preserving both the financial regulatory reform and the reform of our healthcare system. But on the second term, I think actually putting in place a credible and clear plan for long-term fiscal consolidation would be an extremely valuable long-term legacy. And I think that is one that is within our grasp, not to in any way downplay the difficulties here, but I think that is also plays into Democrats and Republicans. If there was, certainly from the polls, the evidence suggests that American people really want to see some action here. And I know there's a skepticism about whether or not their enthusiasm for that will wane quickly once they begin to realize that there actually is some pain involved in fiscal consolidation. But in fact, I think a plan that called for shared sacrifice across a large swath of the American public is one that would in fact have popular political support and it would be feasible to reach. So I think maybe this is just a little bit of the afterglow of an election, but I'm optimistic that such a thing is at least feasible and would carry with it some long, very important foundational improvements for the U.S. economy that could set us on a fairly extended period of reasonably strong growth, given what I see as considerable slack in the U.S. economy and benefits from reducing that.
Dave, you may get the prize for the cheeriest note of the afternoon. Next at the microphone.
Thank you. I'm Stephen Canna from the U.S. Council for International Business. And this is, I think it's a soft, easy one for Adam. You spoke a lot about Italy, Spain, Greece, but in the last week or so, with France has, Monsieur Hollande has introduced a new element into the equation. Could you say a few words about the challenges that he faces? And if he's not successful in making France more competitive, how this affects not only the economic outlook, but the political dynamics inside the EU?
It's a very, it may be a softball, it's a very curved softball. Thank you, Steve. I would encourage you to talk to my colleagues Jacob, Nicholas Angel, and Gary about this, but I'll put in my 2 cents. I think, putting it crudely, a lot of us were waiting for when Spain and Italy worked in concert and then swung France, so that could move the agenda in various ways. Obviously, by implication, saying that therefore Germany would not get to set the agenda in accord with its own domestic political needs. And there was a very memorable occasion about 6 months ago when Italy and Spain did successfully move the agenda in a very constructive way. Mario Monti, who's graced this stage, and Prime Minister Rajoy had managed to do that. Will Hollande be part of a rebalancing in that sense? I think underlying your question is a very important point, which is while the macro numbers out of France for the last few years were not terrible, there is something of the bumblebee to France's economy. We know it flies, but we don't understand why or how. And that remains sort of the great mystery of France. And someday, if someone wants to volunteer to write a book for the Institute on that, that would be nice. But I think to project your question, I think President Hollande is going to have so much to do on the domestic front that you could argue that will make him more willing to side in a constructive way with Italy and Spain, but I fear it means it will make him more self-absorbed and therefore be less willing to push hard in European affairs. I will be very glad to be wrong about that.
I think you'll all agree with me that we had a wonderful presentation. So join me in thanking Dave Stockton, Adam Posen, and Nick Lardy. And thank you all for joining us today.